it's being broadcast live on YouTube, but it's not like just anybody can go in and see this. So it's a private link. So there's a link for people in the class to go view it on YouTube now while we're broadcasting. And then it'll stay as a recording. So if you want to rewatch anything, or you know, for people who aren't here, they can watch it later. So I'm just giving you that as a disclaimer that you are being recorded, audio and video right now, and it will be on the private link on YouTube. I'm going to give you a few other tech rundown things. On the left side of your screen, you may see a white group chat box. And that's where you can text chat, and anything you type there, people in the Hangout here will see it. If you don't see that box, you just move your cursor around on the screen, like on the video. On the left-hand side of the screen, you should see a little menu pop up, and there's a blue text, like text bubble looking thing. If you click on that, it'll bring up the group chat that lives on the other side of the screen. And then anything you type there, like I just typed hello, the whole group can see. So if you have a problem with your audio or something and we can't hear you, you can always type there and we'll be able to see it. It looks like a couple of you have already figured this out. If you want to, if you're on the live call right now and you need to mute your microphone, like you have kids or dogs or something in the background, again, move your cursor around on your screen and you'll be able to see at the top of the page the option to mute your microphone. You can also turn your camera off. Looks like either a few of you don't have cameras or you have your camera off, and that's fine. And then there's a red phone receiver looking thing, and that's how you leave the call if you need to leave the call. Other than that, I think we are set. I'm going to go back into the online classroom just to make sure there's nobody else posting help. But while I do that, it would be really great if you would go through and just quickly introduce yourself, remind us, you know, who you are and where you live so we can remember each other now in almost real life instead of just words on a screen. So whoever would like to start, please go ahead and tell us about yourself. Remember to unmute yourself if you need to.
I'll go first.
Thanks. Kelly, go ahead.
I'm Kelly Crowley. I'm calling from beautiful Winchester, Virginia. I've been having a great time in the class so far. Reading some things that I've never read before, and what's really fun for me as someone who teaches college undergraduates is being in a class with grown-ups and smart people saying smart things. So that's a lot of fun for me.
That's great.
I'm Barbara. I currently live in Austin, Texas. I'm originally from Minneapolis area. I have a foster dog who is just recovering from a horrible abuse situation, so he might squeal in the background, but I'll try to mute if he does. I have a foster dog who is just recovering from a horrible abuse situation.
Sorry, I had to mute things there for a second. I had multiple feeds going. I was getting weird. I was hearing you live and then on the delayed recording. So
okay.
If it got weird, that's why I was quiet.
And hey guys, this is Kristen. I'm in San Francisco, California, and also really digging the class. My background is mostly fiction, so it's really fun to be a novice in this and kind of soak up new learning. So all the links and new journals that you've kind of introduced me to have been really wonderful. I'm really enjoying it.
Oh, good. Great.
I'm Britta. You can hear me?
We can hear you, yep.
Okay, good. I'm Britta, and I'm up in Prince George, British Columbia, up in Canada. And also really enjoying the class and learning lots and looking forward to the next few weeks.
Great.
Hi, I'm Debbie, and I'm in Syracuse, New York. And I'm really enjoying the class too, especially all the readings. I've bought a couple of the books that were listed in the resources section, in brief and in short. And it's just lots of reading I'm doing right now.
That's great. Was that everyone? Yes? Okay. Sorry. Like I said, I'm sorry. I feel very overwhelmed and distracted sometimes at the beginning of the call, just making sure that I have I feel like I'm always like herding cats, and it's not because the participants are doing anything weird. It's just keeping everything straight with the technology and keeping everybody, making sure we're all here. So this is a pretty open format. I don't have a specific agenda. I can help to guide the conversation. If you don't have things that you want to talk about, but I'm here to answer questions, and hopefully you'll share your questions and share your wisdom and thoughts and ideas with the group. So this is informal, and we'll just chat for about the next hour or so. And so if there's any questions to start off with, anybody has one to throw out there, we can start there. Or if not, I can ask something more targeted.
I do have a question. I am kind of curious, and the question came up from practicing our first assignment this week, the flash essay. I'm curious if you have any theories or opinions or feelings about the scope of, say a 1,000 word essay is in focusing in on one moment and kind of exploring that. Is it kind of off limits to go, fully kind of 30,000 foot view and making sense of that from a kind of like an adult reflecting back on a child, or like taking in the full scope of life in the midst of this one moment. So it's not a super articulate question, but I'm just kind of curious if you have any thoughts on kind of the scope and what is or what does and doesn't work and how to make it work if you are doing both.
That's a good question. And this was very articulate, so don't worry. I'm trying to remember what week it is. We look at this a little bit more specifically. It may not be until week 4 where I have an example about it. I don't think it's this coming week. But I give an example of an essay, a flash essay that I wrote, and I show you the breakdown of kind of like my process of where it started and how it ended up. And in that one, it kind of moves through time. And so even though in some ways it's very focused on a single moment, which it starts with me at my kitchen sink washing a piece of produce, and it's very much in that moment, but then it very quickly kind of zooms out to something that I'm thinking about, and then it changes location completely to where I bought the fruit that I'm washing, and then it ends with this person that I was thinking about. So this is a little bit different than what you're asking, but it's along the same lines. So it moves around in time and space, even though it's very much grounded in the imagery and experience of a moment. I do kind of zoom out. As for that idea of taking that 30,000 foot view and how much can you have that reflection, because you've got, when you're writing essays, especially longer pieces, you've got like these 2 main building blocks. You've got, like you said, you've got the scene and what's happening, or the anecdote, however you want to think about it. And then a lot of times you'll have like this voice of experience or these moments of reflection that come in. So maybe you're writing about something that happened when you were a child, or when, 10 years prior to wherever you are now, and you tell what's happening. And then you've got the voice of the narrator telling it about that moment. And then you've got the voice of the narrator of who you are now reflecting back on it. And there's a lot more space, obviously, in more than 1,000 words to use those building blocks and kind of alternate between them. In a flash essay, there's not as much room, but I think you can still do it. So I wouldn't feel like it's prohibited in any way. I think it's fine. I just think you have to, it all has to be condensed. And the other thing that I was thinking about this is when it came up, I think in one of our discussions, I'm trying to remember which essay it was. I think it was maybe the essay Murder by Barry Lopez from week 1. In that one, he doesn't ever give overt reflection, like of his older self kind of looking back on it or telling you what it means. But he slants his details and his information in a way that like his personality is coming through. Like there's a moment, and I think it was Sheila who pointed it out specifically in the comments. There's a moment towards the end of that essay after he has this weird encounter on the road, and I think he writes about, he says something like all his youth, like he drove away, but more slowly this time. I'm just paraphrasing. And so he doesn't say like in a reflective voice, like, and I felt like my youth had ended, or, you know, and I was less optimistic than I was, or whatever it was. But he shows you in the action, the meaning and the emotion of what it meant to him is inherent in the action. And, you know, whether or not he knew that at the time that it happened, that that's how he felt as he drove away, that's up for debate. We don't know. We just know that the narrator shows us that. And so it's kind of like the reflection is almost inherent in the action. That felt a little bit rambly, but I hope that made sense.
Yeah,
It did.
it makes sense to me too.
Okay. Good.
I had a similar question because I'm working on my piece here today, and I think I start out okay. I've got a couple of paragraphs, and then I was trying to step back a bit, or at least switch scenes to present myself going from one place to another, and that ended up being like 2 big paragraphs, which is ridiculous. So so I was just going to have some wine and then think about it and then look at it again tomorrow.
That sounds like a plan.
Okay.
Yeah. Sometimes I play a game where I'm like, how little can I tell the reader in terms of transitions or background information, or even in terms of reflection. And this depends. So it seems like writers often have, like, there's like a spectrum of issues, and people tend to fall on one side or the other with a lot of different things. Not always, but so you're often a person who it's really easy for you to be very much in a moment and like granular, and you just stay there and you can write forever about it. And then there's other people who tend to want to have a lot of scope to what they're writing, and like that's more natural for them. And so if you need it to move around in time and space, or, you know, kind of have this breadth to it, and that's what you feel good at, play a game with yourself of how little can I tell the reader and have this still make sense. So if your mode is to tell a lot or show a lot, to just include a lot, see what you can back out. But if you're the opposite, sometimes you're on the opposite end of the spectrum where you forget that the reader doesn't know what you know and they only know what you tell them, then you may need to play the opposite game of, will this really make sense to the reader if I don't explicitly show moving from one place to the other or explicitly explain something?
So I have a question. How do you know, or what's a good way to figure out if a moment is worth writing about, if it's going to have that, if it's going to resonate with other people, or be important beyond yourself or universal?
Mm-hmm. First thing I would say is, do you want to write about it? If the answer is yes, then it's worth writing about, which sounds a little flippant, I know. But then this question of how do you, I think kind of what you're getting at is, how do you take a moment that means something to you and make it meaningful to other people, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I talk about this as being the personal universal bridge. How do you get across this bridge from something that's meaningful to you and make it meaningful or interesting to other people? And have I mentioned the book in this class yet? By Vivian Gornick, The Situation and the Story.
Yeah, you did, and it's on my table right now.
Okay.
Waiting.
It's here. I'll put in case anyone hasn't seen that yet, I'll put it in the chat box. The Situation and the Story by Vivian Gornick. And I find this book to be, especially the first chapter of it, where she really explains this concept, I find it to be extremely helpful in figuring out how to decide if there's enough meat or heat in a moment or an essay, an experience rather, to make it worth being an essay. And worth, I mean, like, make being that it can hold up to like kind of carrying meaning to the reader. So there's the situation, and that's what happens. That's just what's happening in the story, in the essay. This person goes here, I did this, I did that, I said this, I saw this, the details, kind of the narrative or whatever's happening. That's the situation. Underneath that, you have the story. And that is where the meaning lives. So the situation is what happens, and it's what personally happened. But the story is what it means on a more universal scale. So if somebody wrote an essay about going, this is just an example, actually. I had a different call earlier today, and someone asked a similar question, and they made up an example of, maybe you write an essay about going home as an adult, going to your hometown. You haven't been there for a while, and you're taking a walk around the neighborhood, and you realize that your elementary school had burned down. So that's the situation. But underneath that, what's the real story? What's it really about? Well, that depends on what it means to you, the writer, and it also depends on what meaning you choose to give that experience, because we experience lots of different emotions and themes and ideas in any given time. So maybe this writer who's writing about seeing that their elementary school burned down, maybe they'd had a really unpleasant experience on the playground, that kids made fun of them and called them fat and stupid, and that was something they carried with them kind of their whole life. And then seeing that the playground was gone now frees them from this lifelong pain, like they decide to let it go. So it sounds a little bit like kind of a forced metaphor as I'm just saying it now, but you can see the difference between the situation, what happened, and then the story is this more universal theme of either coming of age or letting go of things that don't serve us. So these broader themes that have some sort of emotional resonance, so that I, as a reader, even if I've never experienced that specific situation, I know what that story is. I know what it's like to feel bad about something. I know what it's like to carry emotional baggage. I know what it's like to want to let it go. So that was very long-winded, but I hope that was helpful. And I really, really highly recommend that book. Does that answer your question? And what do you think?
Yeah, no, that's good. Yeah, that does answer it. And that book sounds useful.
Yeah, and this is actually another thing. I think I'm going to add in the class for your essay for when you critique other students' essays. I think I'm going to add in a few guiding questions to help guide your critiques, just in case you're feeling stuck in doing that. And this is one of the things that I'll explain, the situation in the story, and add as something that you can address in your peer feedback, if you wanted to, because it really helps to think of those two levels when you're reading things and then think about it in your own work.
Hi, I don't know if I actually have a question or if this is just more of a comment.
Sure.
In writing my piece for this week, I found that I had to pull out lots of detail that didn't belong there.
Mm.
There's that feeling of, does the reader need to know this? Do they not? And then I found myself, no, wait a second, that's another essay. Pull that away for another essay. It doesn't belong in this one. And I found myself kind of doing a lot of self-editing that way. Hopefully not to the point where I've taken too much out. But I did find, especially after reading the readings for this week, on detail and how to shade with detail, and what do you provide more detail on, whereas something you don't need to describe the color of something that may not be relevant, but you may need to add detail on another level for something else. I found that very helpful. And I guess, like I said, I found myself taking a lot out rather than putting stuff in. And I don't know if my eye is just becoming a little, better at being able to do that now, or again, if I've taken too much out. So I don't know that I have a question, but
Yeah, no, I'm glad you shared that though. It's really good observation. That ability to take stuff out is just as important. Like the ability to know what to leave out is so important to making our writing as good as it can be. Like, know what belongs there and what doesn't belong there. And so, I mean, you may go back and forth as well. Like when you get feedback on this essay, if people are like, I didn't understand this, or this part seemed a little flat to me compared to the rest of it, then you'll know, oh, maybe I need to add a little bit back in.
okay. Thank you.
Sure. I can't remember in this class who has anyone here already submitted their first assignment?
I just did like an hour ago.
Oh, okay. So, what else are you finding exciting about this form of flash essays, or what are you finding challenging? A question for anybody. Either what you're jazzed about or what you're frustrated with.
Well, I always find in the short form, the endings are so tough for me to leave enough room for that ending and not rush it when you're out of words or whatnot,
Mm-hmm.
or to craft an ending that has meaning.
Yeah. Endings are so tough because there's always that fine line, I think, between giving it like a final oomph and meaning and not tipping over into the moral of the story.
Right.
Yeah. A lot of times it helps, I find, to end with an image of some sort. Something that appeared somewhere else or harkens back to something earlier in the essay. If you can end on something concrete, an object, an image, maybe sound or the sense of smell is important, one of the important senses in what you're writing. If you can end on something concrete, that often provides a nice sense of like weightiness and closure. But it has to be something that somehow ties in to something earlier in the piece. Otherwise, it feels just random or unwarranted. What about anybody else have things about endings that are that you really like? Any endings that you've read that you like or that you find difficult in writing your own? I'm thinking about Brenda Miller's essay Swerve. Can't remember. I mean, that running over the piece of wood begins the essay. Does she come back to that at the end? I don't have it in front of me. I think she does.
I think so. Yeah.
Yeah. And even if she doesn't like actually use the exact word like about the log or the piece of wood, like there's something about that ending, I think, that brings back that idea. And so it has a sense of closure to it, almost like the whole essay's been like bookended by this thing.
She says something about trying to get out of the way. Like I should have tried, sort of harkening back. She said I should have tried to get out of the way.
Yeah,
That's
I'm
what it
sorry I didn't. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's a great one because like it means specifically get out of the way of the wood, but then obviously there's all that meaning that's accumulated through the essay, and she means it in a much bigger way. Get out of the way of this toxic relationship.
And so, yeah, and so I guess on that note, that's what I'm trying to get to. I mean, the things that we're reading, sort of those end punches are coming so organically. They don't feel forced. They don't feel contrived. And I'm feeling really forced and contrived at the moment.
I'm with you there.
So how do you, and I'm not feeling good about it. Like I'm trying to write a piece about something that actually happened recently, well, relatively recently in the last couple of years. And I'm finding myself sounding really sanctimonious and I'm not happy with that, you know.
Interesting.
So maybe I'm not pulling far enough away. I don't know.
It might be that you're not pulling far enough away. It could be that to temper the sanctimonious tone of it, is there some, can you present, can you, the narrator, the persona on the page, show some sort of vulnerability or something unpleasant about yourself and that you are aware of?
I can do that.
So, you know, like if you're writing something and you're just, yeah, you have that sanctimonious feeling, one way to temper that so that you don't just come across as, and people are like, ew, who's this person? Is to show basically your own self-awareness that you're not perfect and that there's some flaw in all of this in you as well. So that might help for that part of it. And as for the endings feeling forced, sometimes, I don't know, I waffle on this because sometimes I think, especially if you don't, if it does, like very rarely, I mean, it happens, but so rarely it seems does the ending just appear before us magically and you're like, oh, yes, this is where I was going all along. Like, usually I have to force it, and then in the revision or as my revisions evolve, either the forced ending then works, or I've revised my way and finally found a more organic ending. So I've had both of those happen where like I wanted to end on this thing, like I liked it, but it just felt cheesy or forced in some way. And over revision, the rest of the essay kind of lived up to it almost. And it didn't feel forced anymore. Or sometimes that ending just ends up going away as you discover a new one. And that, since you don't have a lot of time, and this class is very short, so you don't have a lot of time to write these assignments, and so you are submitting most of the time, unless it's something you had worked on previously. Most of the time, everybody is submitting a rather early draft, and so there's no shame in things feeling forced and clunky and awkward because everybody's having the same experience of that, and it's just a learning situation to get the feedback and figure out if you can keep that ending or not.
I'm glad the question about endings came up because I've also, in keeping with the personal and then making it universal, I've noticed through the whole essay, it's me, I. But then at the end, I noticed, I don't know if it's a reflection or in my ending, wrapping it up, I go to we. Now I'm thinking that's too obvious or blatant to like go from, okay, here's I, and then, like something we don't, da 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 da. Is that a forced kind of transition to make something universal that I'm spelling it out? You know what I mean? Maybe I'm spelling it out too much by going to a we.
Without having read it, I can't say for sure either way, because I think based on what you told me, I think it could work or it could feel forced. It just depends on what's there. So if it feels good to you, like that's where the writing led, I don't think that there's a red flag from what you told me that it's necessarily going to feel forced.
Okay, so I'll have to pay attention in the readings too to see how. So again, I'm glad this question came up because I hadn't even thought about the ending and how it feels.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good.
Yeah, I echo the struggle being the ending, but I think the thing that I'm loving about how short these pieces are is it doesn't feel as daunting to revise because it's like, well, it's just this many words. Like if I wanted to start again from scratch, it wouldn't really be that big of a loss. And having kind of removing that intimidation is very freeing.
Yeah, that's definitely I think the short form can be just as challenging as long form. It doesn't make it easier to write.
No.
And it has its own challenges because everything, like there's not nearly as much room for error in a final draft, but you're right. It's a lot easier to rewrite something that's a few pages long versus like, a 25 word story. I mean, 25 word story. Yeah, no, a 25 page story.
A tweet.
Yeah. We look at the micro essays, including tweets, in I think the 4th week. or maybe it's next week. Maybe this, I can't remember, but it's coming up. So let's see. We talked about endings. I see you just, do you have something, Barbara? You just unmuted yourself.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was just looking for the piece you put up by Michael Knoll. And that really was interesting to me. So in this piece that I'm writing, I'm trying to find my sentence that that I can put in there that shows this absurdity of this situation without saying, wow, isn't this crazy? Crazy thing happened. So I'm really struggling with that, and I may not find it by the time I need to submit it, but it's going to be in my brain.
Yeah,
trying to find it.
Yeah, this technique of showing the emotion through some action or something organic in the essay, it is so powerful and also really sophisticated. Like when you read it and you see it happening in an essay, it feels so natural and it feels like, well, of course. But when you go to do it yourself, it's not easy. It's one of those things, like people who are doing it on the page, they make it look easy. It's not easy to do. So it makes sense that that's one of the things you're coming up against. And I'm pretty sure that most of the time that when it, most of the time, the stuff that looks easy, the author spent a lot of time behind the scenes working on it.
Probably.
Every so often you get lucky. I think Brenda Miller said she wrote Swerve in like one sitting. But she also has a lot of experience writing behind her, so. And also, I should add that it really is okay to tell sometimes. And how much telling you can do depends a lot on subject matter and your style and your preference. And in really short pieces like the ones we're writing, you don't want it to be just filled with telling rather than showing. But it's okay sometimes to come out and just make a statement about what it means or have that blatant moment of reflection.
Okay.
If it's in the same voice and tone and spirit of the whole essay, it's fine. Readers are okay with that. I used to worry about that a lot. I used to think like I had to be very opaque and like just all scene and or just all like metaphor, really. I didn't want to just come out and tell people what it meant. I had this idea that would be making me more mysterious and sophisticated and poetic somehow in the writing. Until I finally had a teacher say like, well, what does this mean? And I told him, he's like, well, why don't you write that? I was like, well, you don't want to tell people, I don't want to dumb it down for the reader. And he's like, you can go pretty far from where you are right now before you're dumbing it down. And I was like, oh. So this is one of those, things that I was on one end of the spectrum. Like I wasn't really being straightforward and specific about anything. So I could push really far in that direction.
Okay.
Yeah. It's so funny. Everybody's like muted. It's just so quiet.
Well, I'm wondering about like what you just said about being too, mysterious or trying to how do you, like, in such a short form, how, like, it still has to be a complete story, or how much latitude do you have to leave loose ends? Or,
I think loose ends are okay as long as they don't feel really central or critical to the essay, to the situation at hand. Like when I read something of any length, I know that the writer is telling me, even in a book-length memoir, I know I'm getting a slice of their life. They're not telling me every single thing that happened to them. And in a flash essay, I know I'm not reading about every single thing that's going on around the narrator. But so I might be read something and have a question come up like, oh, I wonder what's a good example? I wonder, oh, they said they went to school in the Northeast. They went to college in the Northeast. I wonder what school they went to. But the essay is actually not about where they went to school. Like that's not, if that's not relevant to the essay, I might kind of wonder that offhandedly, but it doesn't leave a hole that leaves me unsatisfied. It doesn't raise a question that I need answered as the reader to understand and appreciate the essay. But if the whole essay is about something that happened during university, and it's important for the reader to know that it was an Ivy League university, like there's like stuff in the essay that kind of hints at that, and it's really important for the reader to know that, but the reader's never told that, then that raises a question for the reader that goes unanswered, and it leaves them slightly confused and disoriented and unsatisfied. So it's okay to have these loose ends if they don't really tie into kind of the core of the essay. Does that make sense?
It does, yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, like with so much of this stuff, sometimes you don't know what you can leave out and what has to be there. How much do you have to explain what it means? How much background information do you have to give for readers to understand it? You don't necessarily know that on your first draft. I mean, you probably don't. Like you write the draft and then you see as you revise what you can take out, what you can put in. And then when you have other people read it and give you feedback, then you figure out more of that. Like people are saying, I didn't understand this part at all. You can be like, oh, well, I didn't explain it. Well, let me tell you. So, I mean, I always feel like so much of what I say about writing is, oh, it depends, and it's a process, and you'll figure it out as you go along, which pretty much it all comes down to, but then I figure that life pretty much comes down to that too.
Well, I think you're giving some just great, I think I said this in a comment, that the examples that you give of ideas that you're talking about are very helpful to somebody like me.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
I agree. I echo that. Yeah, this is really, they're juicy little tiny tidbits. Like they're like little micro fiction or micro flash amongst themselves, but they are really helpful.
Good.
Good.
I'm finding it really interesting to look at the voice of all these different pieces and how quickly you can get a handle on that. As I look at the piece I'm writing, I'm like, well, I don't have a voice in this, which of course I probably do, but maybe I'm not hearing it yet. But that's something like I really like Joanne Beard's voice. She's sort of conversational, and I mean, I guess I've read a few of her things, and I just really, really, really appreciate her voice. And also Brenda Miller, I think, has a good voice for me. So that's something I sort of pay attention to.
Yeah, I think that's really important. People oftentimes talk about, as writers, finding our voice. You hear that phrase a lot, and then I'll hear other writers push back on it and say, like, you already have a voice, you don't have to find it, like it's already who you are. But I do think that there's that time and space as writers in general, and then on specific things we're writing, because everything we write doesn't necessarily have the same voice, like or same style. So sometimes it comes pretty quickly and naturally, and sometimes there's that process of trying to figure it out. And reading writers that you like is such a good thing. Like if you really like the voices of those two writers you mentioned, look at their work and really dig into it and figure out, what is it that you like? How are they doing what they're doing as a writer? Like long sentences, short sentences. Do they use a lot of active verbs? How much showing versus telling do they have? How do they use details? So if you really look at all of those things, and then you can kind of partially through osmosis but partially through the actual analysis, you can see what's happening in the writing and apply it to your own work. Another thing that I recommend sometimes is what I call an emulation exercise, where you take a passage from a writer, could be a paragraph, could be a page, take a passage that you really like and copy it down, either type it out or write it out by hand. That in and of itself actually is kind of fun because it gives you an insight into the rhythm and voice in a different way than you get just by reading it. But then you can go a step further and actually emulate their style by, like, I did this with a paragraph from a writer that I like, and he was writing about driving through the fields of Nebraska. And so I copied out a paragraph of his, and then I rewrote it exactly except for the subject matter. So I wrote about, I think, being near the seashore instead of being near a field in Nebraska. But wherever he had a verb, I used a verb. I changed the verb, but I made sure if he had kind of an average, just normal verb like go, I had something average and normal. But if he used a really interesting verb, like, I'm making this up, like sizzle, then maybe I would use an interesting verb like dazzle. And so I was basically copying him. And so I'm not going to like publish this thing as my own thing, but it's an exercise to really getting into the mindset of this writer that I admire and figuring out how their sentences work and rewriting them with my own spin and personality on them, but using that as almost like a template.
That's a cool idea.
Yeah, it's fun to do too.
Did you find that practice actually, like shifted some of your writing, or did you take a different approach after that, or in a particular work?
I think I only did that once where I actually did the emulate, like actually wrote it out. But it helped me to better understand how to read as a writer and how to see what was happening in the work. And that as a whole really changed the way that I write.
Yeah.
And specifically, I used to write very much from an internal perspective, head and heart. Like and this is actually opposite of what I was telling you before about how I said I was told I could go much further in the direction of telling people what it means. But I was writing about what I thought and what I felt, but I also was not like, I wasn't connecting with readers as much. I don't know. This is funny as I'm talking about this. I'm like, this is a paradox. I don't know how I was doing both of these things wrong at the same time. But so I write very much from head and heart without much external detail at all. And then someone pointed this out to me and I was like, oh. And so I started to pay attention to that in writers that I was encountering. How do they use detail? How do they bring in the external world outside of themselves? And how do they convey that on the page? And I was suddenly blown away. It was like this whole world that I hadn't realized. It was like I hadn't realized the world was around me and the world was on the page and stuff I was reading, which sounds so silly, but I was so internally focused in some ways that I was just forgetting to connect the internal and the external. And so I started reading all this stuff, these beautiful descriptions, and fell in love with that. And then I deliberately started writing these little snippets of what turned into a much different series of essays, but I started just writing descriptive pieces about nature and about places I was visiting and describing them. And my only goal at first was to work on that muscle, the describing the world around me. And then as time went on, as I continued to look at the writers that I admired and examine their work, I realized, oh, they're not just telling me about these beautiful or interesting details around them. They're tying them somehow to what they think and what they feel and what that underlying meaning is. So it was kind of an evolutionary process.
That's really cool.
Thanks. I was really glad to have learned that about my own writing, because when I realized that, I was like, oh, I leveled up.
Totally. Yeah. Thank you for sharing that.
Yeah. Anything else? Barbara, I think maybe you're talking, but you're muted.
Oh, sorry, I muted because I've got a foster dog and he's really needy. So he keeps going, meow, meow, meow. Sorry. No, I think that was what you just said, what you did was really interesting because I I was just again thinking about my piece as you were saying that, thinking, yeah, it's all external right now. It's all external because I was afraid to go too internal on it. So I need to go back and think about that a little bit.
Yeah, and at the beginning of class, we had the 1-moment memoir exercises where you make those lists of internal things and the external things, and then you start to connect them. Now that you've got a specific piece that you're working on, you can go back through that and do the exercises again or portions of it with this particular thing in mind, if you found that to be helpful. That was the whole reason I developed that process, is because I realized that what the story I just told you about, where my focus was as a writer and how I learned to bring it together. And I find that, people tend to be either focused on the external or focused on the internal, and then whichever they're not focused on is the one they find challenging to bring in.
Okay.
Anything else? We're coming up to the 7 o'clock my time, but because we started a little late and had all the tech stuff at the beginning, we can go a little longer after the hour. So anything else you want to discuss while we're here? Just going into the classroom to actually pull up what we're. Oh, I don't think I've made it live yet. Week 3. It's going to be all about exploration and coming at things sideways. So we're going to look at a lot of really fun things like lyric essays and something called hermit crab essays. Do you know hermit crab essays?
No.
I see Kelly shaking her head like, what? So it's a term that actually Brenda Miller coined, and it is what's the more explanatory word? Borrowed form essays. So it's writing essays using the form of something else. So like a doctor's medical report or a eulogy. So you borrow the form from an existing form of writing, but you write an essay. Those can be really fun. So we'll look at those this coming week. Oh, and this coming week is when we look at the micro essays, where we do like the Twitter and even 6-word memoirs.
Excellent.
There's that one that's it's attributed to Hemingway, but I think there's doubt whether it's actually his. It's what is it? For sale, baby shoes never worn. Which is just like a whole story in and of itself, and it's heartbreaking. And it definitely, to go back to that question it definitely raises a lot of questions. But I don't know, there's like a sense of completeness about it, even with all those questions. Most of the time that doesn't happen in 6 words. Oh, was that your dog, Barbara?
Yes. That was cute.
He's crazy underweight. He was in a hoarder house with 106 dogs.
Oh my God.
Oh,
Yeah.
He's got his own memoir to write. Oh my goodness.
Seriously, he really does. He is a little Italian Greyhound, and I could take an hour to tell you all the horrible things that he's got wrong with him, but he's amazing. He knows his way around our flat here without sight.
Oh,
he is eating up a storm, which is why he's talking right now, because he wants to eat.
what's his name?
His name is Tavish.
Tavish.
Yeah, the rescue people gave him that name, and I'm just fostering him so I can get him adopted to somebody that.
Oh.
Yeah.
My neighbor used to have Italian Greyhounds, and one of them was named Enzo. And if you're a fan of The Godfather, there's a character in the first one who goes to visit the Godfather in the hospital, and his name is Enzo the baker. He says, I am Enzo the baker. And he says he'll help with something. He says, I do it for your father. For your father.
Yeah.
Every time I see Enzo the Greyhound, I would say, for your father. Okay. I don't want to, keep you here if we've answered all your questions. Anything else? Any comments or anything else you want to ask?
This has been great. It's been really helpful. All the questions and then the responses that you've given. It's been helpful.
Oh, good. I'm glad.
Makes
Yeah.
me want to rewrite my essay.
Wait, did you say you submitted yours already?
No, I haven't.
Oh no, that was Kristen, I think. Maybe.
Yeah.
Well, you can rewrite it. You have until Monday morning. Yeah, it was good to get to hear your voices and see some of your faces. I actually thought we were going to have a bigger group than this. I think about double this had initially planned to attend, but things always come up last minute. So I'm glad you all found your way into the correct link, because it looks like this is recording, so people will be able to watch it afterwards. So hello, all you people watching afterwards. Okay, if you think of anything else that we didn't cover that you want to ask, just leave a comment in the classroom, or you can always email me, and I will get back to you.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah.
Nice
Thank
to
you
meet you all.
All right,
so
have a good
much.
weekend. Bye.
Bye.
Ciao.